classic 260 happened right now. They titled Computer Love, one of their greatest hits album. Absolutely perfect song suiting today. And today, as I mentioned earlier on, that on Bridging the Gap, we will be looking at the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. So if you're just joining us, thank you so much. This is a classic 263, and we get straight into the program, Bridging the Gap.
Welcome to Bridging the Gap.
We are talented. We are fearless. We are empowered. We refuse to be left behind. We are moving forward. We have rights, and we are the future. I have the right to access the places I want to go to. I am a mother and friend. I am a wife. I am a student. And we have the right to inclusive education and educators.
A program that focuses on closing the gap that exists between the able-bodied and disabled groups in our communities. Join us every Thursday at 11:15 a.m. on Classic 263, Bridging the Gap, leaving no one behind. Stay tuned.
Our actions can change the way people are treated.
Indeed, this is the program Bridging the Gap, leaving no one behind, making sure that we close that gap that exists between the able-bodied as well as the disabled, the groups in our communities. My name is Tashinga Masawi. And today happens to be the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. And today we want to focus on some of the challenges as well that disabled people are facing within our community. And this program is proudly brought to you by UNESCO. So today I'm privileged to have with me in the studio the head of UNESCO Education Unit, that is Carolyn Medel-Anonuevo. Thank you so much, Caroline, for joining us today on Bridging the Gap.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me here.
All right, and I'm also privileged to have with me in the studio Nobuhle Moyo. She is the project officer for Leonard, Cheshire, Disabilities, Zimbabwe. Thank you so much, Nobuhle, for coming through to Bridging the Gap. All right, and also I'm joined in the studio this morning by our by our producer of Bridging the Gap. His name is Ian Vambe. Thank you so much, Ian. I think you're not new to our listeners.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Okay, and today we want to look at the International Day of Persons with Disabilities and just start off by unpacking the day itself. Why are we commemorating this particular day, Caroline?
Well, I think we have in the world today 1 billion people with disabilities. Yet they are still the most marginalized, most vulnerable among the world's population. So this day tries to focus on them, to make sure that we are aware of their marginalization, to make sure that they, we know, have human rights, but they are the most of them don't have this possibility to enjoy these human rights. So this day is a chance for them, for us, for the whole world to really focus on the needs of the vulnerable people, the people with disabilities.
I'll come to you as well, Nobuhle. What do you think is the significance of this day?
I think the significance of this day is really to recognize the existence of persons with disabilities, because I think for a long time they've been sidelined. So this is an opportunity to raise awareness on disability issues. So I think that's the significant part of this day. Because it's been commemorated globally.
Yeah, Ian, do you sharing the sentiments as well?
Oh yeah, when you look at when and why the date was proclaimed in 1992 by the UN General Assembly, looking at the main agenda and the main objective behind it was to promote rights of people with disabilities, was to promote inclusivity. So this is the gospel that we're preaching today, that people with disabilities should enjoy equal rights with the next person. They are not second-class citizens to anyone, so they have the right to enjoy anything that the next person is enjoying. So for us to be having this day today, to celebrate, talk about it, should be an awareness-raising day, should be a day to celebrate some of the achievements, how inclusivity has been achieved by any sector in the country, and if there are gaps, how can we possibly bridge those gaps. So yeah, it's a very important day in our life.
Alright, and we're talking about having commemorated this day for a couple of years now, and you looking as well as the progress that we've made and the changes that have come through in the commemoration of this day. What are some of the changes? But I want Caroline to respond first, as she's coming from UNESCO, and then you can also come through.
Well, as I am the head of the education unit, I tend to look at this day as the issue of persons with disabilities from an education lens. So So for example, in 1994 you had the Salamanca Declaration, which emphasized the need for people with disabilities to have access to quality education. 26 years after, what do we have? We still know, and in fact, for this year, UNESCO's, we have all this Global Education Monitoring Report, which is focusing on the achievements of the Sustainable Development Goal. And this year, the theme is inclusive education. And the findings is that there is still a lot of work to be done on people with disabilities to have access to education. So for me, that is an important area of work. And of course, we now know that there's this bill, this education bill, which focuses also on inclusive education. But the question is, how do we make sure that this is really benefiting the people with disabilities?
I would say there's been a quite a good number of improvements looking at how the country is progressing for people with disabilities. Remember, Zimbabwe was the first country to have a Disability Act in 1992, and that act is now currently being reviewed. We now have got a new Disability Act that is being tabled, I think, very soon. So you realize that that's progress which was made by the country. And when you look at being signatory to international documents, Zimbabwe is a signatory to the UNCRPD. We signed the document, I think it was in May 2018. And the UNCRPD speaks more to the rights of people with disabilities, and that is right to health, education, justice, among other rights. And when you look at this now, how has the Zimbabwean government managed to domesticate, or is in the process of domesticating the UNCRPD? There are these aligning laws to the Constitution, which now speaks to disability issues like never before. So there have been strides made, which I think today we should be celebrating. Yes, I know there are a lot of gaps, there are a lot of things that can be developed, but sometimes when I look at it and do a comparison analysis to what Zimbabwe has done in other countries, you really get a reason to celebrate. So yeah, there are quite a good number of reasonable strides made by the country.
Nobuhle, I know that as well. You've got a passion for actually doing justice for people with disabilities as well. And looking at the commemoration of this, there has this brought about change in the passion, in the work of your passion.
So I think when we're talking about justice, we have to say so far they are being recognized persons with disabilities. But as well also looking maybe at the involvement or how disabilities have been involved in the country, we are also noticing gaps they are still existing in terms of access to justice. Because there are issues of maybe information is not easily accessible, the buildings or the courts, for instance, maybe they're not easily accessible to persons with physical disabilities. Issues of communication barriers, they are still existing in terms of maybe at the court, at the police station, sign language interpreters are not readily available. So those are some of the challenges I think that we are going forward looking at international persons with disabilities that need also to turn.
All right. Carolyn, I think she's brought about very important subjects here, saying these are some of the hindrances that come through when they try to seek justice for people with disabilities, access to courts, communication barriers that come through. And we have been commemorating this day, and we still have these gaps existing. What is your standpoint on this?
Yes, in fact, the UN Secretary General also came up with a statement about what is happening to people with disabilities in times of COVID-19. And as we know, COVID-19 has exacerbated the inequalities and the injustices, in fact. And so the people with disabilities are also suffering this now, and they are the ones most affected because of their vulnerability. And I think a very important part of this is to what extent are people with disabilities involved. How are they consulted? Because they're vulnerable, and so you just treat them as objects. But in fact, the challenge is, and that's a biggest challenge. How do you make people with disabilities agents of change?
All right, if you're just joining us, the program is Bridging the Gap, today proudly brought to you by UNESCO as we commemorate the International Day of Persons with Disabilities today. That is the 3rd of December 2020. Remember, also we're also live on Facebook, so if you can go to our Facebook page, that is a Classic 263, and then you will be able to watch as well as to hear our discussion this morning. All right, now Ian, let's unpack the theme that we have for International Day of Persons with Disabilities this year, which happens to be building back better towards a disability inclusive, accessible and sustainable post-COVID-19 world. What does this theme entail?
You can see that the theme is being driven from the COVID context. And during the COVID period, which we are still in a way, we realized that there are so many gaps that we probably should have addressed before this COVID and any other natural disasters. So the theme is speaking to how best can we address gaps that we realized during the COVID period as we move forward. So we're looking at issues of information accessibility, like Nobuhle rightfully said earlier on, to say, was information on COVID available to deaf women right when it started? Was it available to people with visual impairments? Were they able to access information in braille formats? So this is one of the examples where we say information should already be available, but now we are forced to react because of the situation of the pandemic. How best can we move forward now? We're also looking at issues to do with how COVID has dealt with education system. Now our students are having online lessons, radio lessons and all that. But do people in rural areas, those with hearing impairments, do they have access to online education? What can be done? Whereas for someone with a disability, what can we do? So the theme for me is speaking to concerns as well as solution-based approach to the problems that we currently have.
Well, Nobuhle, what is this theme particularly speaking to you in terms of COVID-19?
I think, as it says, being get better. So I think the main aim is that we can gain the way that we've done in terms of disability issues. So somehow, even before this COVID challenge that we have, we need somehow maybe preserve and also continue to advocate for those gains that we've achieved, that they will not lose momentum with the COVID-19, because currently I think most of the COVID is COVID-19. So I think for me, it's how best can we go forward, in terms of being disability inclusive, at the same time looking at COVID challenges that are there, so that we don't lose momentum of the things that we've been previously.
All right, Carolyn, you want to add on?
Yeah, in fact, I'm going to talk about the statement of the UN Secretary General. A very important aspect, because we know already they are the most affected because of their vulnerability. And then, of course, the question is, how do we really involve them in their specific vulnerability? How do we involve them? Meaning, how do we craft solutions that are really able to be responding to the different disabilities? Because we know that we say persons with disabilities, but even disabilities is very diverse. So different responses needs to be crafted, needs to be made so that they are accessible to these different disabilities.
Now, Ian, what approach can we probably make? He's talking about it, the different types of disabilities as well that are out there. How then can we make sure that disabled people are included with their various disabilities?
First and the most important thing is we need to understand these disabilities. We need to be able to categorize them. There are physical, which are visible disabilities, and there are more invisible disabilities, which are mostly not understood by people. They just think maybe it's a condition, it's something else. So the first thing is we need to understand a disability, then we can further try and understand the different needs and how best can we help people with that particular disability. For instance, let's look at people who are epileptic. You cannot automatically see that this person has epilepsy. But when you get to speak to them, when they speak about it themselves, when they use enough awareness by responsible authorities, we get to know about epilepsy. Then we can know how do we get someone to manage having seizures in public. For instance, let's look at someone who is at school. Does the teacher know how to handle someone if they have seizures in class? So that's number one. We need now to look at epilepsy from that perspective. How do we capacitate teachers? We go back to the issue of policy at institutional level. Someone is coming from a teacher training college. They haven't been taught on how to handle people with different disabilities. So the issue comes back to policies that we implement at various levels. So like the example that I gave, if someone is coming from a teacher college, knowing how to handle someone with epilepsy, knowing how to handle someone with albinism, when they go in class, when anything happens, they have been trained. They already know how to do that. So the point that I'm making is to say we need to understand the different disabilities. Then we make policies informed by those different disabilities and different needs.
Ian is bringing out an important point to say when we go to our schools, we've got children who've got various disabilities within our schools. But do we have teachers, do we have administrators at schools who know how to deal with these disabilities, who know what to do when they have disabled students at schools?
I think that's the next challenge, because I think even if going beyond the education, because for us as we highlight earlier on that we're also looking at issues of justice, gender-based violence, how maybe the civil providers, are they able to follow a girl or a woman who is a survivor of gender-based violence when they've got a disability, they've got hearing impairment, they've got mental impairment? What capacities do they have for them to be able to assist that girl on an equal basis with other girls who are not, who do not have a disability? So I think that gap still exists on how best can we handle persons with disabilities, looking at different spheres from the political, economic, even the social aspect. So I think there's need for more tailor-making, even everything that we do. If we are going to say we're going to have a police on education, from the very onset, we need to have a tailor-made policy that will include children with disabilities or persons with disabilities, women with disabilities.
I think, Caroline, the issue of inclusivity, and she's talking about even just the making of these policies that affect people with disabilities, they need to be included in the making of these policies as well, so that they come on board. How do we get to that point as a nation where we're saying disabled people actually crafting their own policies?
That's a very important point, and as I said, the UN Secretary General mentioned that in addressing COVID-19, people with disabilities have to be involved. But to be involved, it means you need to empower them.
Yeah.
They need to be able to understand the whole process of lawmaking, negotiating, and not come from a victim's approach,
True.
but rather to say that here we are going to take part, and it's a big endeavor, because we know that persons with disabilities, they have challenges with identity. All throughout, their families, communities are telling them, you are not really part of this community. And so this excluded mentality is very much affecting their identity. So we need to make sure that the persons with disabilities are really have that strength, have that confidence. And I think that's a most important part of the agenda in terms of making people with disabilities active agents of their destinies and to be participating in nation building.
Yeah, and I think we spoke about this and we touched on it sometime as well. As I always use you as an example to say, when it comes to issues of disability, you have a disability and you've been able to be confident, you're able to stand up for yourself. And sometimes we even forget that you have a disability because you don't treat yourself as somebody who has a disability. What can you say about what Caroline is talking about?
The good thing is you're seeing it now, but it didn't start now.
Yeah.
It's a process.
Yeah.
And I've always said that this process, people often see results, like you're saying, but it starts from the family that you're coming from. The way you're treated by your mother, your brother, your father, whoever is immediate to you, determines how you grow up, how you see yourself, and how you probably present yourself to people. So you realize that the moment you're treated as an extra child in the house, someone who is bringing extra cost, it becomes difficult for you to even think that you are worthy of anything. But the moment your mother sees you as a child, I've always given an example of my mother. She used to walk with me holding my hand in town, and everyone was looking back at me. It was frustrating for me during the early days, and I was, why is everyone looking back at me? But little did I know that she was actually preparing me for the world, because you get into people and they're actually looking at you, they look at your disability. So if I wasn't used to that growing up, it was going to be difficult for me to do anything. But because I normalized it at a very young age, I saw disability as anything. I didn't grow up being reminded of my disability every day. I focused more on things that I could do. So to come back to what she said, that rather is that what we need to focus more on is the family, the society, the community that we live in. How do we treat people with disabilities? So you realize that if you are an extra child in your family, you cannot even stand up to say I have good rights, because you don't know about these rights. You haven't been taught about them. So whoever is responsible for taking care of anyone with a disability is therefore entitled to build their confidence, to tell them, let's focus on your strength, let's focus on things that you can do, rather than reminding you of things that your disability stops you from doing. Let's focus on what it doesn't prevent you from doing, that you can actually excel. So yeah, society has a role to play, and like I said today, I'm in a celebratory mood because we're celebrating this day. And you look at some of these things and you say, there are so many families that could have buried me alive or something, that could have hidden me, but I was brought out, my mother exposed me to the world, and there are more other people like me who are also exposed, who are enjoying. So yeah, I would say we really need to learn from that, and we that should be our starting point as we move forward towards inclusivity and accessibility and any other thing we can talk about.
And we celebrate people like you today as well. What have you managed to achieve? Especially take us through you going to high school and coming through, and then also what you've managed to achieve, and to be where you are today, even though you have a disability.
Um, it's really fun when you look at it, because you say you're celebrating it, but I'm grateful for about where I am today. I haven't made it in life to say anything big, but just the ability to go to school, a decent school, and to have a leadership quality that I think my mother identified in me at an early stage. She was always telling me that you are a speaker, you need to be able to speak to people. And primary school, secondary, high school, I was always in leadership position. And currently, one thing that I celebrate most is that I am currently a member of the second Southern Youth Parliament, which have got only 5 people representing Zimbabwe. I'm the current chairperson of the African Union Youth Club on disability issues. And I'm a producer here. And these are some of the things that probably people always to celebrate bigger miracles or bigger things. But for me, looking at where I come from, things that I've done, people that I've met, sentiments I've had, different opinions over disabilities, but I look at it now and I say, okay, there's still a long way to go, but at the same time I'm also here, I'm also celebrating things that I've done already.
No, Nobuhle as well, we're talking about, looking at Ian's story and just sharing with us, especially on this day, International Day of Persons with Disabilities. How important is it, especially for society, for parents, to have a bearing on their children so that they can turn out to be, bright stars in the future?
I think as Ian has spoken, I come to realize that disability is just a social construct. It's something that we grow up teaching our children that people with disability can't do this and just stay in the home. But if we start seeing the person first before the disability, you will see that we will achieve more than if we are looking at a disability. If we say this person has got a physical disability, so in terms of maybe transporting them to school, it's difficult for us, then that child will not have access to education. But if we look at that person as the future of tomorrow, as the president of tomorrow, as the leader of tomorrow, then that will change the mindset of the families that the persons or children with disabilities are coming from. So we need to remove that social construct. So maybe through awareness raising on disability, not just disability. So I think those are some of the issues that maybe if we are going, we are maybe told the families we need to raise to them.
20 minutes before we get to midday here on Classic 263, the program is Bridging the Gap. Today proudly brought to you by UNESCO as we commemorate the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, today being the 3rd of December 2020. All right, now as Caroline, she talked about how important it is, especially the role that the parents play, especially when it comes to persons with disabilities and generally how they turn out in the future. Can we change the mentality of society to be more accommodating, especially to persons with disabilities?
Of course, everything can be changed, because our ideas, our beliefs, and the parents' beliefs are coming from society. So the main task, in fact, is to make sure that different segments of the society are having a transformed perspective about disability. And I think it's a very interesting perspective that it's actually just a question, disability is a question of social construct. And that's why I would like to say, and back to my education hat, the teachers really play a very important role, because after all, for those who are able to go to school, teachers send a message. And in this global education monitoring report, which is focused on inclusive education, there's a very important segment which says, indeed, there's evidence all over the world that teachers are important in making sure that their students, for example, in the class, are able to have, even because not only addressing persons with disabilities, but also sending a message to the other students, that disability is not a way of discriminating other students, but it's a way of relating to these kinds of differences in abilities. So that's why for me, teachers, just like the mothers and the fathers, they are the ones who are responsible for shaping society vis-a-vis the classroom. So it's important to see who are the key molders of character of the people. And it's the parents, it's the teachers, it's community leaders, it's the political leaders. So these, how would you say, mind molders are very important, and I think that's why we need to also reach them.
All right, we're also live on Facebook. You can go into our Facebook page, Classic 263, and you'll also be able to join us in this conversation. Remember, you can also come through on our WhatsApp platform if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask the people in the studio. It's 0719-498-651 and 0719-498-651, and you will be able to come through and ask the relevant questions that you might want to pose to our guests in the studio this morning. The program is Bridging the Gap. My name is Cheshire, and today we're commemorating the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. Okay, now Ian, when we look at the issue of representation, especially for disabled people within Zimbabwe, the government then reserved 2 seats for senators with disabilities. How do you think this move has actually helped, especially fight for the rights of people with disabilities?
I would want to discuss that in the context of we didn't start by just reserving. There was advocacy work before that. People crying for representation. What can we do? What's the best available? Then in 2018 there was that provision of saying there's a reservation for 2 seats for senators with disabilities, which is a very good move, which can be developed however. But like I said, I'm celebrating that wasn't there before. It was introduced in 2018, and now we have a starting point. Now we are crying for seats in the House of Assembly, the National Assembly, and to say we need to have more members of parliament, we have seats reserved, but we actually have a starting point. To come back to your question, to say how effective has it been, when you look at senators, they don't really get to debate issues week in, week out. They are more on the legislative side of it, and they are serving a larger constituency, which is about 7% of the Zimbabwean population are people with disabilities, and they are serving that population, yet there are only 2 senators. How do they do it? Now we talked about the Disability Act that we had as a nation, which was introduced in 1992, and there was no any other law in between. But now we're talking about this, the new Disability Act. It's a result of those senators being in such a position. We are also talking about how do we align existing laws to these Disability Act that we are coming up with. There's a new education policy that we are also crafting. So when you look at the effectiveness of that move, personally I would say it has been effective. I would give it a 7 out of 10. Looking at the laws that are coming into place now. But what's most important is how do we move forward? We have a starting point. What can we do? Recently there was the talk of the Constitutional Amendment Bill where they wanted to reserve seats for young people in Parliament. But we are coming to say, of these 10 seats reserved for young people, how many are disabled? How many are women? How many are what? So there are further segments to how we can move forward regarding this representation, and to say that if we get to see 2 senators being the starting point, if we have got more young people reserved seats for in Parliament, we are taking steps, we are building upon from what was introduced in 2013. So yeah, it's been a very good move, and I think we can develop as a country.
Caroline?
Yeah, I think the challenge we face is that we are having different realms. We have the political realm, we have the family realm, we have education, and then the broad, we have religion, of course, here in Zimbabwe, it's very important. And then we also have the community realm with heads, chiefs. And I think the challenge is how can they have consistent messages? Because we know that in these different realms, you can have contradictory messages. And so that means, if I'm a child and I see this in the sphere of politics, it's not this is how they treat people with disabilities, but in the homes, this is how they treat it. So the challenge in the end is how to have a consistent messaging, which means in fact empowering people with disabilities, because until that people with disabilities themselves are able to show their strength and not let the others who are speaking in behalf of them, that is, I think, one important challenge. And I think by having people with disabilities speak about that in International Day of People with Disabilities is a very important step.
Nobuhle, do you want to add on?
I think just to add on to what Carolyn is saying, the issue is of capacity to definitely disabilities, even grassroots, to be part of leadership positions that are there, where they might be reserved those seats, but they will not be a person who will be able to access those seats, because those are practical issues that we were talking previously, how they've been discriminated before. So we need even our programming that we are doing we need to capacity build to start with the leadership position within the community, because there are leadership positions that are there, even in support groups, they are to share people, people sales or something like that. So it starts from the grassroots, from the family, from the community, as you are saying. So I just say with this day, we need to capacitate and build leadership.
True. And also Zimbabwe being a signatory to the United Nations Convention of people with the rights of people with disabilities.
Yes.
What do you feel like we're anywhere near implementation, especially to what we assigned to?
You realize that the UNCRPD speaks to things that disabled people want, which I also believe the Zimbabwean leadership want people with disabilities to have. We're looking at issues to do with inclusivity, accessibility in broad. We're talking of accessibility of health, education, transport, and all that. So in terms of implementation of what we signed to, we have done something which we can still develop upon. Because when you look at the UNCRPD, there is Article 5 which speaks of equality and non-discrimination. It's broad, but then you can subdivide it to say, when you say non-discrimination, what are we talking about? Employment opportunities. One of the examples we've used when we say equality and non-discrimination is when you look at in Zimbabwe, maybe for the past 5 to 6 years, the police and the army have been the consistent employers within the country. They've been taking people. And for some people with physical disabilities, it was more like an automatic disqualification. To say you can't sustain the training, you can't therefore execute the expected duties of you. But we're saying there are other countries that we have seen army generals on a wheelchair, police officers were very effective on a wheelchair using crutches and all that. We are saying as a country we need to look at other things to say how do we best accommodate them. Are we only saying because it's a very physical job, therefore you can't? But you realize that you might need think tanks behind the military, think tanks within the police, IT technicians and all that. So these are policies we say as a country we need to look at, say when you say non-discrimination, what are we saying? Because it's a very broad term which can be generalized to say we're giving you, we are sending advertisements to everyone, so you should just apply, but there are technicalities to that. When you also look at issues to do with equal recognition before the law, which is section 12 of UNCRPD, equal recognition before the law, Nobuhle Moyo was talking about how do girls struggle to get access to justice. What are the barriers? These are the things we need to deal with when we say we are now implementing the UNCRPD. Physical barriers. Where are our courts located? How do people get there? Even the numbers of courts in rural areas, remote areas. If someone gets raped, they want to go and report. You first go to your police station. There is no officer who can attend to you using sign language. That's more disheartening. Just say, why should I proceed with this case? Even when you go to the court, you're supposed to. Sometimes there are cases where they are asked to bring their own interpreters, which is very expensive to bring an interpreter because they'll charge you something like $20 for 30 minutes. So imagine you're the victim, you're someone who's supposed to pay. So there are a lot of issues when it comes to implementation. Nonetheless, as a country, we have done quite good when it comes to implementing these issues of inclusivity and equality. And she was talking about education. Now we have the inclusive education policy coming up. But we have seen and heard the government talking about everyone needs to go to the same school, all that. But like I'm saying, that we need to be more focused on different disabilities, on what technicalities then do we need to address. But as a country, implementing, we are on the way, but there is really need of more work to be done. Just the last example to say, remember when there was the outcry of women empowerment, there was a top-to-down approach. It was coming from powerful women, ministers, presidents, vice presidents, all that. Everyone was talking about women, gender equality, 50-50 women, all that. So it made noise. But when you're talking about the rights of people with disabilities, it's a down-to-top approach. So if you are making noise at the grassroots, yes, it's fine, but we'd also appreciate it if the noise is coming from the top. That more it's very impactful and effective. So everyone needs to be on the same board with the same mind, then you can probably have an effective implementation of the UNCRPD.
Caroline?
Yeah, I think as we celebrate the International Day of People with Disabilities, a big element is making these disabilities issues very visible. Because I think even as we are having persons with disabilities in our organizations, the question is to what extent this is really widely understood and appreciated in the whole society. Because if we just continue to be among ourselves, and I think that's what UNESCO has been trying to do, is to advocate for persons with disabilities human rights, for participations and empowerment. And I think that is where we need to be more consistent. Today is a very important day, but I think it's we need to do this 365 days a year. Of course, in the same way that we have the International Day of Women, I always say that in fact every day we need to think of gender issues, the disability issues, and really embed it in our lifestyle. When I see a person with disability, how do I react? How do I ask other people, especially the people who are responsible for shaping our minds, like the teachers, how can we make sure that the multiplier effect is really going to change the minds and souls of people?
Right, and Nobuhle as well, as to what they're talking about in terms of inclusivity. But I just want to take you to the issue of what activists actually call for. Some activists are calling for the issue that when it comes to people with disabilities, there needs to be a standalone ministry that represents people with disabilities. Do you think that this is the way that should go, and maybe will it make a difference?
Yeah, because it's got because currently maybe we should go from the women's the focus is more on women, and you see the changes that are also happening. So maybe if we are taking it from that aspect, you see that maybe if we put our own ministry for persons with disabilities, maybe the changes will also come through. And also I think they need also even to ratify the conflict, because currently there's not a very signed it. So in terms of monitoring the implementation process, or even people who follow us on to what extent they've implemented ABCD, it's a challenge. So I think as a starting point also is now we need now to ratify the convention on persons with disabilities.
Alright, somebody's coming through to say, hey Sashi, good job. I'm tuned in from the UK via Facebook. I wanted to ask about what you just mentioned about 2 seats in Parliament for disabled people. Doesn't that create a sense of othering a person with a disability, or even sound like tokenism? I believe the work starts with parents teaching children to look beyond someone's disability, and the work carries on at school. Children with disability, even if some need special care, should go to school with other children so they grow up together, and the other children learn to see beyond someone's disability.
What is the I mean, we can always agree to disagree looking at things. When I say look at senators who came in this term, and we talked about having a Disability Act of 1992, which never spoke to the needs that we have today, and now we are having a new law. Yes, we can call it's tokenism, but for me it's bringing results. That's a starting point. That's how we can probably develop and have more. So you realize that we need to sit down, take a review of this. Was that effective? How can we best move forward? Well, look at the issue of women. They've got 60 seats reserved in Parliament. It's up to them to sit down and say, what has changed? How impactful was this? So for us, for me specifically, it has been a good move, which can be further developed. It's a starting point. We cannot sit back and relax and say, okay, now that's fine. But we can obviously develop from that. So it's a good starting point. I wouldn't want to say it's tokenism per se. It's quite a good reservation, which can be made better by having more seats in the Parliament and more seats even in the Senate.
All right, Caroline, as well, maybe we've got just a couple of minutes to go. Maybe what would be your words, especially when we are looking at this International Day of Persons with Disabilities, to the people out there who are listening, and particularly as well to parents of children with disabilities?
I think we can summarize. I would summarize it in one sentence. How do we open the spaces in society for persons with disabilities to participate more meaningfully?
All right. And Nobuhle, as well, I'll come to you. And obviously, Nobuhle, I also want you to touch on especially the issue of schools, to say, just quickly, to say, should we have schools specifically reserved for disabled people, or should we be mixing children within the school so that we teach our children to look beyond disability at a very young age?
Okay. Yeah, I think we need to, as we are moving, I think even the theme is saying inclusivity. So what it means basically, even in the education, say we need to have an inclusive education, because I think we've been talking about issues of social constructs of disability. So if these children with disabilities are learning in their own schools, and then children without disabilities are learning from their own schools, the discrimination will continue, because whenever they go to the community, after school, they will continue to discriminate those children with disabilities, because they don't understand the disability that they have. But unlike if they're learning together, they understand the children with disabilities within that school setup. Even the learning process is also inclusive of children with disabilities. You see the mindsets will change, because sometimes if you maybe start raising awareness with children who are still young, you will see changes. Unlike if you are now trying to teach adults and everything, you know how it is with adults. Sometimes they'll be saying, no, we don't want to do this. But a child can learn and process that what they've learned and implement what they've learned. So I think we need to start with them at a still tender age, so that we raise awareness on issues of disability.
All right, and I'll give it to you as well, Ian, just to round off this discussion that we're having today on the International Day of Persons with Disabilities.
Well, I guess there are still more issues. This conversation might have just started more issues on how can we probably develop more. So my message to everyone is to say, now that you have heard something that probably you didn't know before, what are you going to do as an individual? What are you going to do as a mother, as a teacher, as a parent, or as just a responsible citizen? But my heartfelt message for today is that I posted on my social media platform to say, my family played its role in molding me, and the community contributed. And obviously because they knew me, and you know someone, you listener, you know someone with a disability. What are you doing in molding that person? What are you doing in ensuring that they realize their best potential? And when they were doing it back then, they never knew that results will come maybe 10 years or 12 years later. So you just do good to someone with a disability. Just if they need a hand, just give them. They need a word of confidence, just say it to them. You never know what you're doing to their life. So yeah, I would say today as we move forward, people should just play their part in ensuring a very good world for people with disabilities.
All right, thank you so much. This has been the program Bridging the Gap, and this morning I was joined by the head of the education unit at UNESCO. This is Carolyn Medel-Anonuevo, and I was also joined by Nobuhle Moyo. She's a project officer from Leonard, Cheshire, Disabilities, Zimbabwe, as well as Ian Vambe. And I really want to say thank you to my co-producer right here at Bridging the Gap. My name is Tashinga Masawi. Ian has challenged us. You obviously know somebody within your communities who has a disability, and let's make positive changes in their lives. Join us again next week on Bridging the Gap.
Talented, fearless, we are empowered. We refuse to be left